Hey creeps, it's Horror Free For All. I had so much fun making my first video for this playlist I affectionately call Hall of Creeps, where I examine movies that, in my opinion, remind me a lot of my favorite horror franchise ever made, Creepshow. As in, the movies kind of feel like a Creepshow segment, but have nothing to do with Creepshow and were never officially released in the IP. This film actually came out in 2001 that I'm bringing up today. It was a part of a 5-movie set of sorts released by Sony Home Entertainment under the banner Creature Features. Now, these 5 films were actually soft remakes of classic 1950s monster movies. And some of them, as in the case of this movie, got a complete facelift and almost complete rewrite to make it unrecognizable to the source material. Now, is it better for worse? You be the judge. This film was directed by Scott Zeal and had a plethora of writers that I recognize wrote movies that I've seen before, such as Return to Halloween Town and the God Is Not Dead series. Ironic that the writer of Return to Halloween Town and the God Is Not Dead series worked on a film together. Go figure. The film in question is Earth versus Spider. One, right before the apex of Sam Raimi's Spider-Man films, which, in case you weren't around at that time, were pretty much the hottest thing on the planet. From toys, merchandise, commercials, spin-off video games, you name it, Spider-Man was here to stay. And since that point, Spider-Man has now been rebooted technically 2 more times with the Andrew Garfield movies, and as recently with the Tom Holland movies that are probably going to keep continuing for the foreseeable future. But did you know that Sony, right before that apex of Spider-Man, made a soft Spider-Man movie in a horror lens? That is this remake, Earth vs. Spider. It's essentially about a character called Quentin Kimmer. And Quentin is a security officer at this research facility who is conducting lab tests on this foreign species of spider. Quentin is an avid comic fan, and he has a best friend named Han, who you might recognize as the actor John Cho from the Harold and Kumar series. He and his buddy obsess over a mutant spider superhero with 6 arms, and Quentin is probably the world's #1 fan of this superhero. He has collectibles, he has many comics of said character, and he even has action figures laying around his apartment. And just like Spider-Man himself, Peter Parker, Quentin has his own Mary Jane, so to speak. Quentin, one fateful day, stumbles across an opportunity he can't refuse. Since he's a security officer at a research facility who is conducting lab research on spiders, Quentin is thrusted into a situation where his security officer partner loses his life due to a robbery gone wrong, let's just say. And Quentin, distraught over this realization of what happened, and after talking with the police, sees within a lab, he notices that there is a spider serum said to contain particles of spider DNA that they are researching in how to transplant into other organisms to give them powers of a spider. Since Quentin's feeling lucky, he injects himself with said spider serum and waits to see if anything happens. Shortly thereafter, Quentin, quite like Peter Parker, realizes that the serum has worked, and now he's gained new powers that he wasn't expecting. From crawling on walls to super strength, he now figures himself to be a hero. And he sees an opportunity one day to show off to his love interest how far he's come and how heroic he can be. Building up the courage to tell his best friend, he does so in confidence, thinking that he's now a superhero and he can live like his favorite fictional hero. But as time goes on, his body starts to react in other grotesque ways. Beginning with a chest abnormality that starts to open up a gaping wound and shoot out webs from his body, so to speak. Following that, he starts to have these outbursts of uncontrollable anger and hysteria, and his body is starting to become weak and achy. This builds up to a point in the story where he starts to notice that his body might be mutating. So, distraught by this realization and how much he's become a monster, he is struggling with the idea that all of these hopes and dreams that he's bequeathed onto himself by injecting him with the serum has been all for nothing, and he's pretty much signed his own death certificate. While all this is going on, there is a detective investigating a series of accidents involving certain people dying in the story. The detective, played by Dan Aykroyd himself, an SNL icon and even a mild horror legend in some regards, starts to piece together a suspect profile that fits Quentin's description. We ultimately arrive at the point where Quentin has now started to lose control. And from there, we see what happens with that in all of its grotesque glory. I'm not one to always throw artistic metaphor onto film, but I definitely see the visual art on display with this movie. Quentin is a character fascinated by comics, wrapped up in fiction, and wants to be disjointed from reality. And when he's given, quite literally, a fictional opportunity that should not exist, that said opportunity is the very thing that ropes him back into reality. Unfortunately for him, the reality he now lives in is one he does not really want to be in. The story is littered with metaphor about living vicariously through your heroes, becoming a hero yourself, and what that actually entails. While it doesn't quite explore the hero side of things and what makes a hero, it does kind of scrutinize the elements of the origin of said hero and how all of this stuff becomes even a thing. It's quite easy to see the comparison of Quentin to Peter Parker, but a lot of people out there that have seen this movie will tell you that Peter Parker is a much more relatable character. And part of that has to deal with the creator of Peter Parker not wanting to give him a really shitty outcome with said mutation he receives. This is, simply put, a horror version of Peter Parker's origin story. What if everything went wrong for Peter Parker? What if he was some hapless dweeb with no real ambitions other than to be a fictional character? What if Peter had everything go wrong in terms of how his powers were brought upon him? What if Peter experienced bodily mutations that went further than just giving him powers to walk on walls, to have spider senses, and to have super inhuman strength? That's this movie. And a lot of people probably can't see the novelty in turning a superhero character into a horror film. As a matter of fact, this has only been done a handful of times. You can probably count on one hand and maybe a few fingers exactly how many times this has actually been done. The closest thing this movie has in terms of cousins is a film by James Gunn called Brightburn. And all Brightburn is a what if Superman, as a kid, didn't have good parents or, let's just say, the right environment that he needed. With this movie, it takes a different approach. The natural idea is to go body horror with it. And to be honest, that's one of this film's greatest strengths. If I haven't said this before, the iconic Stan Winston, of all people, who has a repertoire of just amazing practical effects in almost everything he's ever done. It's no different here. What Quentin goes through is very reminiscent to how Seth Brundle went through his bodily transformations in the original Fly remake in 1986. And a lot of naysayers over the years have used this against this movie, saying that it's not only ripping on Spider-Man and his origins and mythos, but it's also ripping on David Cronenberg's masterpiece, so to speak. Now, I'm not one to tear down a good idea, but a soft continuation of what The Fly was doing with insect body horror and using that to reimagine a superhero in a fun, creative, meta type of way was really fun in my book. I'm not going to lie, the acting ensemble in this movie also does kind of help it for me. Seeing John Cho, a very young Pedro Pascal, and Dan Aykroyd in a movie, you can't buy that type of billing these days. And not to mention how much screen time some of these actors get really do show me that they wanted to make this line of creature feature movies something special. If you don't believe me, you can look at all the creature feature movies that were released around this time, and there's not a lot of no-name actors in these movies. No. It seems like Sony actually ponied up the money to get some real talent in these, which I think really does help this film in the long run. When it comes to the atmosphere and how the plot unfolds, there's a gratuitous amount of comic love letter effects going on in the film. We see comic panel shots of this fictional spider character cutting in and out of the experiences Quentin is going through and how that parallels to the comics that he's read and what he's experiencing in his reality. And I think that makes it a shoe-in to the Creepshow franchise. And I kept thinking in my head, how cool would it be if they did the Creepshow red and blue effect right in this scene? It would literally feel spot on to a Creepshow segment. Yeah, you can probably notice that the budget isn't the greatest here, and we'll get into that in the negatives shortly. But this film has a very intimate atmosphere, set around mostly Quentin's apartment building and how it's become sort of a spider nest. It's almost too on the nose with Seth Brundle's experience in the original Fly, given that as his transformations into a human hybrid monster made him more noticeable in a crowd, he had to hide himself away. I don't think people give enough credit to how much of a love letter this movie really is. You can clearly tell that the people behind this had a passion for comic books, had a passion for Spider-Man, and some of these ideas I think were so cool to the Sony execs that we saw a very similar element added to Peter Parker in the very first Spider-Man movie that Sam Raimi produced. And that actually carried on through all three of those films. And that in question is Spider-Man actually having real webs come out of their body. I can't say that Peter Parker did it first because Quentin Kimmer did it first here. Now, a good amount of you that have seen this movie before have probably been waiting for me to give this movie a little bit of lashing. First and foremost, I think the pacing of this movie can be a little all over the place at times. The first 20 minutes have an electric pace, and then it takes seemingly forever once Quentin injects himself with the serum to go through, I guess, the first stage of his newfound transformation. And if I haven't said this before, I'll go ahead and reiterate this. The budget does kind of rear its ugly head at times. I'll just leave it at this. Once Quentin starts to go through bodily transformations and stuff starts mutating on his flesh and his body starts to grow extra appendages, there's entire scenes missing context of how certain said appendages or certain changes on his flesh have now changed into something else completely, and the other things have just up and disappeared. Now, I couldn't tell you if that's budget or they had to have certain prosthetics for certain scenes to I guess, bring out more of a scare factor. I couldn't tell you. But you will notice, once I point it out to you, that issue. While it's a love letter to comics, and while it's essentially a horror version of Spider-Man, you bring the issue of, does the main character deserve this? And to be honest, no. Quentin does not deserve what happens to him in the story. Yeah, if you weren't empathetic in this situation, you can just write off Quentin's experience as he did it to himself. Kind of like a very classic Creepshow segment, The Lonesome Death of Jordy Verrill, which honestly has a lot of similarities to this story, and even David Cronenberg's The Fly. Now, what makes that segment a little easier to stomach than a full-length movie like Earth vs. Spider here is that you don't have to spend around an hour and a half getting to know this person. And unlike David Cronenberg's masterpiece, there's not a lot of time to really flesh out relationships and building a likable character, because the character is trying to actively be a superhero, which rears out the superhero cliches that we've seen done, at the bare minimum, since the early 1960s. I can totally see people writing this movie off and dismissing it, and some people might actually agree with my assessment, saying that this probably would have served better as a short Creepshow segment in an anthology movie or TV show than an hour and a half movie. That doesn't change my thoughts and love and appreciation of this movie, because when I saw it as a young kid, it reminded me of my love of Spider-Man, and it reminded me of my love of horror. And this was honestly one of the scariest movies from my childhood that actually gave me nightmares. As a grown adult who is 30 years old at this point in my life, watching it now is still just as horrifying as it was when I was a young kid. Perhaps I should not have watched it that young, but it showed me what this movie is, and honestly, I can appreciate it even more nowadays. I feel like this movie was too early on. Perhaps if this movie had come out 20 years down the pipeline, when we had the MCU in full effect and superhero fatigue, I think this movie could have been a bigger hit if perhaps a studio like Sony wanted to take a legitimate chance on it and give it a theatrical budget and try to push it as a legitimate horror film. Perhaps in hindsight, I think this film's biggest detriment that I could possibly say against it is that it takes itself a bit too serious in that fanboy mentality. Because when you have a comic trope-filled movie using dated tropes that go back to the 1960s, and you try to build up a hero gone bad and become now a reluctant anti-hero, so to speak, you got to make sure there's some compelling character stuff in the mix, or better character writing to flesh out relationships to make this harrowing journey, and horrifying journey, I should say, more compelling. And that's why this movie ultimately failed with critics, in my opinion. Now, if this movie came out today, who knows how the audience would react to it? Maybe given MCU fatigue, maybe given the rise of horror films kind of becoming the new superhero movie these days again, this film could have found an audience in a theatrical setting. But with all that said, if I had to rate this film from a 0 to 5 star basis, I still love this movie despite its problems. Yeah, we can really beat this movie over the head if we really wanted to sit down and scrutinize the writing at points and how meandering it can feel. But at the end of the day, I see this movie for what it is. I can see some passion and some heart put into this. And honestly, because I'm a massive Creepshow fan, and because I love comic books in general and comic book related media, this itches a scratch that I'm always yearning for in horror, but hardly ever get. I'd probably give this film a 4.5 out of 5 stars. Yeah, some people might be shaking their head at me, especially if you've seen the film before. You're like, ain't no way it's that high. Well, I get that. But I love me some monster schlock, y'all. Sue me. I like an idea of making Spider-Man a horror film. So that's my thoughts on Earth versus Spider. Till next time, take care, everyone, and have a great day.